the gravy simmering, and that'll be simmering for some time, but we need to make the meatballs, so we're going to go ahead with those.
Now comes the fun part when we're going to have Etta do a little bit of work.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So what you're going to want is a nice large bowl to make this with so that you can mix these well. This will probably make 20 to 26 meatballs, probably something like that.
Okay.
So what we're going to start with is about 2.5 pounds of ground beef. Once again, you know, this is one of those things where different people do different things. Traditionally, Italians would typically use a third, and a third when it comes to ground meat, with ground beef, ground pork, and ground veal. We are just going with ground beef. There you go. So we have 80 here.
Okay.
So I'm going to put this into the bowl to start with. Throw that away. Okay, the next thing I would like you to do, Etta, which would be to crack those 4 eggs into that bowl. And we will mix those up. You can use 3 to 4 eggs in here, depending on, again, how you like it. And it's one of those things that's going to help to bind the meatballs.
And I wish I knew how to crack these eggs with one hand. I haven't learned that yet.
See if I can still do it.
Wow, I
Piece of
learned
cake.
something new. Piece of cake.
One of the key things with eggs are that they're fresh. As long as they're fresh, you can do that. If they're not fresh, they don't tend to crack, as you know, you'll get little pieces of the eggs in there. So, okay, so that's what we're starting with. One thing that I will say a lot of other families use to do this is to use something with, they'll use bread and milk. So sometimes you will get chunks of bread, stir that in with milk, and almost make a paste of it and put that in there as opposed to eggs. And that's what they use as a binder. But this is what we're going to use today. So let me rinse my hand, because that's what happens when you crack an egg with one hand. So what we have here is approximately a cup and a quarter, 1¼ cups of Italian spiced bread crumbs. We have a cup of grated Parmesan cheese. We have approximately a tablespoon of marjoram. We have about 1½ tablespoons of, I take it back, we made this a little short. We got 1 tablespoon of parsley as well, because we're going to add some fresh parsley to it. And then we have, I believe, about 2½ teaspoons to a tablespoon of salt, and about a teaspoon of pepper. And then we again have about 3 or 4 cloves of garlic. So we can start putting these in. Your hands are clean, right?
My hands are clean. I just washed them.
So we're going to have Etta to start mix the meat, and I'm going to start pouring this in as she's doing it. And what you want to do, you want to make sure it's mixed as well as you can. And you're going to want to try to fold it as much as you can, but there's no real way to do it other than to really get your fingers in there and do it. I have seen people do this with food processors. It is a possibility to do it, but again, I just don't think there's any substitute for getting your fingers in there. So
just get your fingers dirty a little bit. It's okay. It washes right off.
So we're going to now add some cheese. Then we are going to add our garlic.
And I'll just keep mixing as you keep adding.
Okay. Then we're going to add our marjoram. Let me sneak in there real quick just so I can
release those flavors in that marjoram.
There you go. And we're going to add our parsley. Do the same thing.
Oh, when you smush those together, I can get that nice flavor.
You can smell that, right? Yes. Now we're going to put our salt and pepper in. And while Etta's doing that, I'm going to chop up some fresh parsley, and I'm guessing this is going to come out to about a tablespoon, maybe 2 tablespoons. You can do this, again, something else I like to put in here sometimes is spinach. If I put in the spinach, I won't put as much fresh parsley in at all. Usually I'll just use the dried parsley. But there is nothing like the scent of fresh parsley, and it does come out well. You're going to want to chop it relatively roughly. You know, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you want to avoid having completely large leaves if you can. So,
chop fine, but not.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be like it looks when it's dry.
Nicely and yes, nice fine chopped, but not minced.
Right. So now we're gonna add this.
Wow.
All right, so you don't have to do this, but. We're good.
Meatballs.
And one thing,
So you do
flip it
eggs?
from the bottom, make sure there's none on the bottom.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it does.
Like I just-
Okay, so Etta has done a fantastic job here of mixing up the meatballs with all of the ingredients. And now we're ready to do the rolling. So, what we have here is a nice, nice sized cookie sheet pan basically. What I like to do is put a piece of tin foil in there so it stays clean, and then I like to put a little piece of parchment paper over it. It tends not to stick and burn as much.
Okay.
So we're gonna set that here. At the same time, we've already had the oven heating up. It's at about 400 degrees. I know it says 450 on there, but my oven is a little temperamental, and we do have a thermometer in there to make sure that we're pretty accurate. So the only other thing you need is a bowl of water, basically. And the reason for the bowl of water is simply to keep your hands moist. The meat doesn't stick to it. It allows you to roll the meatballs a lot more easily. So Ed and I are going to share this.
Okay.
And so basically, you're going to get your hands wet, and you're going to make meatballs. And again, you can make meatballs any size you want. You could even make a meatloaf out of this if you wanted to. But what I typically do is you try to get about the size of a golf ball or a little bit bigger than a golf ball, which is about there. You want to roll it till it's reasonably smooth, and it's so that it adheres to it. If you have chunks of the meat all over it still, then it will tend to break apart once it's in the gravy. So we'll do that, and then we'll start putting these on our cookie sheet. My dad used to own a tavern back in the day, and one of the more popular items that he had were what he called balls in a bowl, which were meatballs. I think he put 2 or 3 meatballs in a bowl with a piece of bread and the gravy over the top, and that's what they would eat. And in fact, interestingly enough, when my nanny would make these on Sundays, that would be our lunch. Essentially, she'd get a piece of bread, put it in a bowl, put a meatball on top, put some gravy over the top, and that's what we'd eat,
Sounds like
keep
an
our-
open-faced meatloaf. Sounds like
A little bit.
It sounds like an open-faced meatloaf. that
With
you can
spaghetti
order-
gravy.
Right, with spaghetti gravy that you can order at a restaurant these days.
Right, I mean, people, you could make this without making the spaghetti if you wanted to. Just make the meatballs and make meatball sandwiches.
Oh.
That would be another thing you could do with this. So.
And these are some hefty meatballs.
And gravy, the other thing about gravy that's really good is once it's cooked, you can certainly freeze it.
Oh, good.
So if and that's why when you make a big pot of it, typically it's not going to go to waste. Even if you have a little bit left over, put it in the freezer. Generally speaking, what we used to do all the time is to fry these. Okay, and quite honestly, I would say they are a little better when they're fried than when they're baked. But the mess, the cleanup that comes with frying them has become, at least in my life, a little more complicated. So I found that, especially when you're putting them in the gravy, they come out pretty darn good like this. At least 90% of the flavor that you'd have otherwise. But the traditional way would be, you'd probably, like you deep fry anything, maybe you get a pan with about that much oil in it, get it very hot, up to about 375 degrees, and then you're going to drop your meatballs in there and turn them as you're frying them so that you brown them all the way around, and then put them on paper towels or whatever, or something to drain them, and let them cool a bit just to get some of the oil out, and then you're going to put them in there. What we're going to do instead is we're going to bake these, and they're going to come out just fine. Again, I have it on about 400 degrees, and we're going to put them in there for approximately 25 minutes, and I'm going to set it for about 10 to 15 minutes so that we can flip these around.
Okay. And when you bake the meatballs, you can also save your stomach line a little bit more healthy than frying them.
It is, which is a little more of a concern these days compared to when I was growing up. I don't think anybody was thinking about that too much then. So.
So we've got the meatballs cooking, we've got the gravy on the stove, so it looks like we're ready to wrap this up.
And I'm just going to stir the gravy up a little, and then we'll be back, I guess, when we're flipping the meatballs.
Okay, sounds good.
All right. Okay, they're looking good. So now we've definitely got some cooking meatball. You can see some of the fat is rendering from those.
And the smell is...
We're starting to get a little
Delicious.
scent, not tremendous yet, but I'm going to give you this as well, Etta, so you can hold the pan. And we're just going to try to flip them around. And you can see that they're browning on the bottom. And again, that's what's good with the parchment paper, is it allows it to brown without sticking. Okay, so you can see we've basically got all of our meatballs flipped over. So I'm going to put these back in the oven for another 10 to 15 minutes. And Etta, if you would get that oven door. Okay, so we're going to put these back in. I'm going to set this timer for 10 minutes. And at the same time, it's a good time to take a look at your gravy. Right now we have some bubbling going on, and it's probably about the consistency we're looking for. It's a little watery still, but since this is going to cook a while, it's right about where we want it. It's starting to thicken up a little more. And you don't want it to be completely thick, but you want it to be thick enough so that it sticks to the pasta. So we're going to give that a good stir, and we're good to go on that. And then once these meatballs are done, we're going to show you, we're going to take them out. We're going to put them on some paper towels to drain them a bit, and once they cool a bit just to get the oil off of them, then we're going to throw a bunch of them right directly into the gravy.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, our timer went off, so our meatballs should be ready. Let's take a look. Oh yeah, baby.
Wow,
You're looking good now.
look how evenly browned those are.
Those actually came out really well browning wise, so. And that adds a nice flavor to it.
And they're still kind of round, they're not so flat.
And then we're going to take our meatballs to drain them a bit now. As you can see, there's a... So now we're going to take our meatballs and just drop them into the gravy. Again, I'm going to try to get as much of this fat off as I can.
And you're just gonna add them to the gravy, and about how long will you cook these so the flavor gets?
I would say you're going to want to cook them at least probably a half hour to an hour in the gravy.
Okay.
Just to cook them through, because when they're, in the oven, they definitely cook through a lot better than they would if you were frying them. When I fry them, for example, when you cut one open, they're still pretty pink inside, even though they're browned on the outside.
Right, because you've got a nice fairly sized meatball.
Right. A little bit more of that off. Okay, so then we're going to just want to make sure we dip them below, into the gravy, so they cook thoroughly and evenly throughout. And we're still basically done. Again, it's up to you how long you want to cook it. Now that we've put the meatballs in there, I would say, at least a half hour, probably at least another hour we want to cook that gravy. But if you wanted to cook it for another 4 or 5 hours, more power to you. It certainly adds a flavor. The other thing I would add is, typically when we make this, we're going to serve it that night. When we would make it on Sundays, we would serve it that night. However, if you have the time to make it the day before, putting it in the refrigerator and letting it sit overnight just adds a little something more to it to me. So that's why it's one of those things that I think is even better the next day.
I agree with you.
So that's spaghetti and meatballs with gravy.
Okay. And then you can just add your favorite pasta with
Oh,
it.
yes. So whatever pasta you're going to want to make, obviously you go to any store, you're going to see a variety of types of pastas. You're going to have your basic pastas. Here we have a basic spaghetti that we're looking at, and that's fine. That's what we're going to end up making. There's, mastacholi, rigatoni. I mean, any number of those.
Any.
Right. But these are your typical boiling ones that we're going to use. So you boil it, follow the directions on the package, and you're good to go. Another thing you could potentially do is homemade pastas, or frozen raviolis, or things of that nature, lasagna. I mean, whatever assortment of things you could potentially make. Making pasta at home is another chore, and that's another thing for another day. But it certainly is really good to have fresh pasta, and fresh pasta is a lot faster to cook than this type of thing. So, but once it's done, once your pasta's done, what I typically do is to get a nice large bowl for the pasta, put some gravy into it, and then put your pasta after you drain it, mix it up so that it doesn't stick together. And then everybody can add as much gravy on top of that as they like.
Sounds good. It is a very versatile recipe, as we've seen. Thank you for joining us to share with you your Nani special gravy, spaghetti and gravy and meatballs.
No problem. It's always fun to have it live on.